Ford is winning the horsepower war, and I want to know how. So I want to have a look inside and find out, what is it they're doing? We're going to take apart this 2011 Scorpion engine that Ford sent me in 2010, and it's been on this stand ever since. Mike, it's time to blow a Ford apart. I'm Gale Banks. You may not know this, but I've been hot rodding Ford since 1956 when my dad asked me, "Hey Gale, go out there and put a new head gasket on your mom's Model A." It's the last time she ever saw that car. Today I'm going to talk to you about a 6.7 liter Ford diesel engine known as the Scorpion. This engine was quite a participant in the ongoing horsepower wars between the big three. While I'm interested in the current horsepower war between Ford and Duramax, this isn't the first horsepower war between these two engine types that's ever existed. The original one, and somewhat unknown one, took place in 2011 and late 2010. It had to do with peak horsepower and peak torque to be claimed on their respective 2011 models. In February of 2010, GM announces the new Duramax-powered Silverado, but does not reveal the horsepower and torque, kind of waiting till Ford tips their hat. In March of 2010, 1 month later, Ford announces a best-in-class 390 horsepower at 2,800 RPM and 735 pound-feet of torque at 1,600 RPM. Now, it's kind of crickets for a while. Ford's put their cards on the table. But then in June, GM announces the Duramax will have 397 horsepower, beats them by 7, and 765 pound-feet of torque, beating their 735. But Ford had certified 2 power ratings with EPA and CARB. In other words, they had a smog-legal hole card. So not in July, but in August of 2010, Ford announces an upgrade to 400 horsepower and 800 pound-feet of torque. Whoa. First horsepower war, Ford prevails. When Ford first announced their early numbers, you can look at the horsepower and torque curves that they published at the time and see the torque curve just goes flat on top, and to some extent, that impacted a little flatness on the horsepower curve. Look at this. They just lopped off the top of the curve. When I saw this back in the day, I thought, oh, that's dirty. They're going to come and get GM. And sure as hell they did. Here's the updated dyno chart. The curves look like they're supposed to. So why am I looking at this engine? Well, first of all, I have a brand new one. And secondly, this is the OG Scorpion that started this whole thing between them and Duramax. There's a number of things that intrigue me about this engine. The first is, it's what's called a hot V. The intake ports are not in the valley of the engine. The turbocharger resides there. The turbocharger resides in the valley of the Duramax as well. But what's different here is the exhaust manifolds are in the valley, not the intake manifolds. So let me take you through the air intake path. This has to be the craziest casting I've ever seen. There's so much going on inside one piece of aluminum. This oval-shaped or elliptical-shaped inlet hopefully is fed by a Banks ram air intake system, cold air intake system, into here. So here's air in going to the turbocharger. Here's the turbocharger. Notice the turbocharger has a normal compressor inlet, and it has this other guy going on here. So there's something strange going on here. We'll come back to this. Let me take you through here. Into this casting, out to the top of the turbocharger, and to the normal position on the turbocharger, through the compressor, and I'll tip it to you. There's 2 compressors in here. We'll get back to that. Off to the charge air cooler, which sits on the inner fender well. Now, to make all this stuff work inside the truck. It's my memory that Ford actually moved the inner fender wells out. They had 8 inches more width inside the engine bay to deal with all this. They put a liquid coupled charge air cooler on the fender well, so the boost air goes over to the charge air cooler, returns from the charge air cooler, and into this throttle. So that throttle exists for EGR purposes. And oh, by the way, there's another passage to take the cooled exhaust gas recirc gases into here and blow it into the intake air. Inside this tube looks like a mushroom or an umbrella. The EGR is blown into the underside of that umbrella and blown back into the flow, kind of mixing it a bit. So the boost air enters here through the throttle into the EGR mix. EGR goes in here, goes through that section and down into this sink trap looking thing and up here into the intake manifold. So the boost air from that intake casting flows upward into this intake manifold, splits up here and flows down into each valve cover. Yeah, valve cover. The valve cover is the continuation of the intake manifold, and the intake ports are on the outside of the head. So this is radically different to anything you've seen before if you've never experienced a Ford Scorpion or a similar hot V engine. Now, a lot of hot V engines I've seen, including some prototypes that never made production, have manifolds on the outside, intake manifolds on the outside of the head, and they don't run the boost air through the valve cover. There's a lot of volume here. There's a lot of volume in the casting we just looked at, and then you've got the volume in the charge air cooler on the fender well and the tube back to that casting through the throttle, EGR mix, etc., up into here, the volume of the manifolds, the volume of the valve covers, and the volume of the intake ports. You got to fill all of this with boost pressure before the engine responds, before you can put fuel enrichment in. You don't want a rich bump till the air gets there. You don't want a smoke bump either. There's always this question, is the hot V really an advantage or not? Well, with the hot V, you've got exhaust manifolds out here. Here you can see one of the exhaust manifolds still bolted to this cylinder head. And there's a flange here that feeds EGR into the EGR system. That being the case, you've got a lot of heat to deal with in here that's right underneath the intake manifold. You've got radiant heat from the inside of the engine, the oil, etc., on the valve train, heating the casting. It's all negative. It's a lot of volume. The shorter intake tract is something I would prefer. You know, I'm just talking my preferences here. I kind of like the charge air cooler, liquid coupled, built into the intake manifold in the valley, which really shortens up the inlet tract. And then you've got exhaust manifolds either way. You got to fill them with manifold pressure to drive the turbine anyhow. So yeah, you don't have up pipes, but the intake tract here is pretty profound. So you got to take one delay versus the other. I don't know if anybody's ever proved it, whether or not there's an advantage either way. But let's look at this, because this is quite unique. All right. So now you get a better look into the intake manifold that's built into the valve cover. This is the entry point. Take the valve cover off and we'll be able to see a little bit more from the underside and get our first peek at the valve gear. Looks like I know what I might be doing. The ports are on the outside of the valve cover. You can see the image of them here. And here you're coming into the ports on the cylinder head, and they've kicked to the side here. This is really interesting. They're directing the intake gases to the side. So if we look at this properly, so it's kicking the gases this way into the ports. That's interesting because these are the intake valves, here, 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 and here. So as you're kicking the gases this way, you're adding some swirl torque when those valves open. Clever. These guys thought of everything. But the thing that's the most remarkable is there's 4 rocker arms and 4 push rods on every cylinder. I mean, this is something special. These guys came up with a system wherein there is not 2 rockers and 4 valves. And a lot of those have drawbacks to them. When you pull the valve cover off, it's suddenly, whoa, where did this come from? The rocker arms are sheet steel. They're like stamped out of steel plate, and then they're formed for a pushrod cup and a rocker arm face on this steel stamping. Somebody got real clever here. There's a ball pivot underneath. We'll look a little more detail here in a second, but basically you've got 4 rockers, but you've only got 2 lifters. You've only got 2 cam lobes and 4 rockers. This replaces a somewhat problematic thing that's decades old, and that's where you've got 4 valves, 2 rocker arms, and to push both valves open, both intakes with 1 rocker or both exhausts with 1 rocker, you got to have some sort of a bridge piece that the rocker pushes down on the bridge piece, and it in turn pushes down on 2 valves. The thing I don't like about that is if the valve springs are not equally matched, when the rocker pushes down, the softer one goes down and leads the one with the stronger spring. So when we race like a Duramax, we precision match the springs, and not just the spring pressure, but the open pressure, the seat pressure, and the spring rate in between. So we know they'll progress evenly. I bring the pistons a lot closer to the valves, so to speak. How do I do that? Higher valve lift. And when I open them, related to where the piston is in the bore at the time. So without getting too deep into that, these guys have solved it. They've solved that crosshead or rocker bridge or whatever term you want to use. I think we need to go back to the table and talk about this, but one feature I want to point out here is how they lubricate all this. This is a spray bar. It has 4 outlets, very microscopically small outlets, delivering oil into this friction system, 1 for each rocker. So it's lubing the push rod to rocker, the rocker to valve, the pivot of the rocker underneath this bridge. And there's also a slop mechanism here that holds the rocker up against the pivot. It's blued, it appears to be a spring steel mechanism. So here's the cylinder's worth of valve gear, including the roller tappets. Quite a large diameter roller, needle bearings inside, so they're pretty high llama. They're guided through this cassette that prevents them from rotating in their bore and sliding sideways on the cam lobe. What's kind of cool about these, and Ford has a patent on this, there's 2 hydraulic lash adjusters inside each one of these rollers. These little guys, they're not very big. They insert into the roller with the ball tip up. They drop in, and this is a 0 lash hydraulic system. So you never have to lash this. The push rod goes in with the cup down, which is highly unusual in rocker arm systems, and ball up. And there are 4 push rods, 2 lifters, and 4 rockers. These rockers are sheet steel. How the hell they form the various components on the rocker, starting with the friction face for the top of the valve. You've got to have a beautiful radius, the right alloy, the right hardness to go 500,000 miles or more. It looks like, and if this is true, it looks like these shapes, the ball pivot for the rocker and the pushrod cup for the pushrod all appear to be formed out of the parent metal of this stamped piece. If so, these guys are geniuses. I mean, it's a fabrication miracle, to tell you the truth. There you got it. 2 lifters, 4 push rods, hydraulically adjusted, and 4 stamped steel rocker arms. And they run this up, probably the limiting speed is well above 3,300 RPM. I know the horsepower peak on the 2011 engine is at 2,800 RPM. The horsepower peak on the current engine, the one that's really the badass 500 horse, 1,200 pound-foot engine, that horsepower peaks at 2,600, a little slower. But a lot has happened between 2011 and 2024. But don't worry, we'll get to the 2024 engine. So if you think this valve gear is interesting, wait till you see this turbo. All right, so this is the Garrett dual boost VNT wastegated dual compressor on a common shaft turbocharger. I don't know what they left out. Ceramic ball bearing. Let me take you through this baby. I'm going to start on the hot side because one of the advantages of hot V is you get the exhaust energy right to the turbine wheel, right? I mean, that's what everybody says is the advantage. You got exhaust manifolds conventionally on the outside of the cylinder heads. You have pipes that lead up to the turbocharger inlet on the aft end of the engine. I've seen it tried different ways. In this case, you didn't get rid of, if you will, the up pipes. Here they are. So you've got 2 pipes with bellows to align any misalignment, which also, they streamlined them. That's nice. Put a sleeve inside. But the inside diameter of all of this stuff, in fact, the inside diameter, here's one of the exhaust manifolds. The inside diameter of this exhaust manifold out is incredibly small. They're keeping the velocity up so you can kick the turbine in the ass more readily, but you trade that velocity for drag and back pressure versus the small size. So there's always a trade-off somewhere. I'm quite an advocate of higher cross-section and solve your response problems elsewhere. And then they introduce into the turbine housing, which houses a VNT section, what they call variable nozzle turbine, that allows you to vary, if you will, the flow onto the turbine wheel to speed it up or slow it down. But just in case that didn't work sufficiently, they also threw in some old school, and there's a wastegate. Here's the arm to actuate the gate inside the housing. And here's the diaphragm, which, oh, by the way, is vacuum operated. You don't naturally get vacuum on a diesel engine. So there's a mechanically driven vacuum pump hiding elsewhere on this engine to drive something like this vacuum actuated wastegate. So you've got 2 boost control systems on the same turbocharger. So you got to get the shaft speed kicked in the ass and up to speed before you get compressor RPM sufficient to make things happen. And it's this compressor I really want to show you. Remember, we have 2 inlets into the turbocharger, the conventional on-center inlet, and this other inlet that goes to what would be the back plate behind the compressor wheel. So if we take off the compressor housing, it becomes apparent they've got some anti-surge technology in this compressor cover, which appears to be acting probably the most effectively on what is the front wheel. But what we have here, and it's very difficult to see the back wheel, but on a common shaft, we have a compressor wheel with 2 faces and 2 sets of vanes or fins, whatever term you like using, on a common shaft. The blade count looks to be very similar. I can't see that much of the rear except in this cutaway that we're showing you on screen. And then it's pretty obvious what's going on, and we seem to have some anti-surge technology also on the back compressor impeller. What we've also got is from the front bearing in the bearing housing to the tip of the shaft is inordinately long. And there's much more mass on there, almost the mass of 2 compressor wheels. The whole idea here was to have this work at low boost pressure, low shaft speed, low mass flow, all the way up to high boost pressure, lots of density production, and therefore lots of mass flow per CFM. It's all out here. It's like a popsicle on a stick. You've got all this mass dangling out on this shaft. So they put these ceramic bearings in here because back then, that was the hot lick. Everybody was going to ceramic bearings for better response. They did tests at Garrett, ball bearings versus plain bearings, and low mass rotating group versus conventional mass rotating group, and they found that the mass of the turbine impeller shaft and compressor impeller was more meaningful to turbocharger response than the bearing system. In other words, if you use the same bearing system in both cases, and of course guys, hey, spin this. You know, you've been at a trade show, they grab the shaft, they spin it, it keeps spinning. Ball bearings, they're dry. Now spin the plain bearing, you spin the plain bearing, it's dry. Well, that's not how they run. The plain bearing runs with an oil film. So the shaft is not touching the plain bearing like it is on the bench or the display at the show. And the ball bearings are interfered with lubricant gumming up their rotation. So this stuff on the table, spin the thing, So when you do it on the gas stand and you put the exhaust energy to it, and you've got a compressor load, and there's virtually no difference, then why are you paying for the ball bearings? Man's got to ask. In this case, this cantilevered load, they started this in 2011 production. Through 2012, they're having lots of bearing warranties. Compressor on a stick. So they went to steel ball bearings for the next 2 years, and by 2015, they had discontinued the whole turbocharger. I can't imagine the amount of money they spent on design, bugging this out over a period of years, tooling it, producing it, only to have it gone in 4 years. There is one thing that I really like here. It's something I've been doing most of my career, and it's this exhaust outlet, mounts on the turbine housing. See the shape? Cobra head is a term that guys at Ford use for this. And this is double cool. By that I mean, it's cool because of its shape. This is called NACA duct, N-A-C-A, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. It's a government agency, started in 1915, was disbanded in 1958. But these guys saw to World War I fighter aircraft, all the way through the Bell X-1 breaking the sound barrier. NACA had to do with it. But I like this because it's the lowest loss way of making a tight 90-degree bend. This one in particular has a chamber between the inner and outer section, which also provides kind of an air barrier type of heat shield between this and the firewall in the truck. And for my closing act, I want to show you one serious oil pan casting. This thing, you know, you talk about that air intake piece with all the passages in it. This is the second really complex casting on this engine. Let me take you through the oil flow. It's pretty damn cool. Oil pickup in the bottom of the pan, feeds from the bottom of the pan into the oil pump. The oil pump's a gerotor, which is frankly my preferred design of oil pump. There's some pressure regulation that goes on up here at the front of the cylinder case. So the oil comes out of that gerotor pump into this bore, and there's a cast-in oil tube that feeds it inside the oil pan into the oil cooler, out of the oil cooler, across, once again, inside the oil pan to the oil filter, out of the oil filter, and then up here and into the engine, into the block. And consequently to the heads, all the lubricating chores are fed by that hole, turbocharger, everything. So I want you to know, these guys weren't slacking structurally or thermally back in 2011. We've got a compacted graphite block, which is current technology, and my preferred block casting alloy. We've got 6-bolt mains, 4 down and 2 side. So you've got side-bolted 4-bolt mains if you want. We've got a forged steel crankshaft. We've got rod bearings which are tangless. There's no tang to guide them side to side. And there's an upper and lower identified by the dark upper and the bright lower. Same with the main bearings. So when you're assembling the engine, you know which bearing goes where. The rods are forged powder, cracked cap rods. So the alignment of the cap, once you've machined the rod, you take it apart, clean it, put the bearings, and wrench it back together. It is absolutely perfectly aligned every time. Unless, of course, you put the wrong cap on the wrong rod. Then it's chaos. The pistons are gallery cooled, so there's cooling nozzles down in the block, and you can just catch one looking up the bore at us if you look down the bore. There's an oil gallery inside the piston crown that cools the piston with engine oil. So this is the granddaddy of the Scorpion that's winning the horsepower wars today. I can't wait to get my hands on one of those 24s. Hey, Mike, can you put this engine back together for me?